Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty unsettling. The idea of a snitch state taking root here in America. We're basically talking about a system where people are encouraged, sometimes even rewarded, to report on each other to the authorities. We've got three really fascinating sources to unpack all of this. We'll be looking at the historical context from the Miller Center, then we'll examine Senator McCarthy's censure from the U.S. Website, and we're going to end by diving into some modern-day parallels laid out in this really thought-provoking 2024 article from The Atlantic.
What I think is so interesting about this whole snitch state concept is how it really taps into these deep-seated psychological mechanisms. It plays on our innate fear of social exclusion, our desire to conform, and even our tendency to kind of see those who hold different views as potential threats.
Just like that old saying, if you see something, say something, taken to a whole new level.
It's
But before we get into the modern-day stuff, let's take a trip back in time to the Red Scare of the 1950s. The Miller Center gives us a great overview of this period. And it's chilling how much of it echoes what we're seeing today.
Yeah, the Red Scare was just a time of intense paranoia with this widespread fear of communist infiltration in every corner of American society. And Senator Joseph McCarthy, he was a central figure in this period, using his position to launch these highly publicized investigations into alleged communist activity.
And it wasn't just about investigating right now. McCarthy would publicly name names, accusing people without solid evidence, creating this climate where anyone could be branded a communist sympathizer and ostracized. It's no wonder people were terrified to speak out.
Yeah, McCarthy's tactics were so effective at silencing dissent. And there's
Wow.
this one quote from him in 1953 that really captures this chilling effect. He said, "Any man who has been named by either a senator or a committee or a congressman as dangerous to the welfare of this nation, his name should be submitted to the various intelligence units, and they should conduct a complete check upon him." It's not too much to ask.
It's like he was laying the groundwork for a system where mere suspicion was enough to warrant investigation and surveillance. And it's disturbing how much this rhetoric kind of mirrors what we hear from certain groups today.
Yeah, and it's crucial to understand that McCarthy wasn't operating in a vacuum. The fear of communism was so widespread, and many people, including President Eisenhower, were initially hesitant to even confront him directly.
The Miller Center describes how Eisenhower at first seemed to take a more strategic approach, trying to undermine McCarthy's influence without making him a martyr.
Yeah, Eisenhower was walking this tightrope, trying to address these very real concerns about communist influence, while also safeguarding these core American values of free speech and due process.
But there's this pivotal moment described in the Miller Center's account, Eisenhower's use of executive privilege to block McCarthy's investigations into the U.S. Army.
That was a turning point for sure. It signaled that even the president was starting to push back against McCarthy's overreach, and public opinion began to shift as well. People were growing weary of the constant accusations and the damage being done to individuals and institutions.
The Senate website details how this shift in public sentiment culminated in McCarthy's censure. The hearings regarding his conduct were televised, and the American people got a first-hand look at his bullying tactics.
One particularly striking moment during those Army McCarthy hearings came when the Army's lawyer, Joseph Welch, directly confronted McCarthy. He said, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency?"
That was a powerful rebuke delivered on national television. You could almost feel the air go out of the room. And from that point on, McCarthy's political career was essentially finished. But the legacy of McCarthyism, with its chilling effect on free speech and its reliance on suspicion and accusation, continues to resonate today.
And this brings us to the present day, where this Atlantic article argues that we're seeing a resurgence of these tactics, but with a modern twist, this new snitch state. It isn't just about fear-mongering and public accusations. It's about using the law and policy to incentivize people to report on each other, often for personal gain.
And the article uses Texas as a prime example of this trend, focusing on some specific laws and policies that have created this climate of surveillance and mistrust.
One of the most disturbing examples is what's happening with abortion rights in Texas. The article describes how the state's bounty law, officially known as Senate Bill 8, allows private citizens to sue anyone who helps a woman obtain an abortion after 6 weeks of pregnancy.
So it's not just about restricting abortion access. It's about deputizing ordinary citizens to enforce the law with the potential for financial rewards.
Exactly. And the article highlights the case of Marcus Silva, a man who is suing his ex-wife's friends for helping her get an abortion. He's seeking a financial reward under this bounty law, which allows for a minimum of $10,000 in damages per defendant.
It's hard to wrap your head around the idea that your friends, or even casual acquaintances, could be sued for helping you access healthcare. And the implications for personal relationships are terrifying. Imagine the chilling effect this has on conversations, on trust, on the very fabric of our communities.
It creates an environment where people are constantly looking over their shoulder, wondering who they can trust and who might be reporting on them.
And it's not just about abortion. The article points out how this snitch state mentality is being applied to other issues as well, particularly those related to LGBTQ rights.
The article discusses Governor Abbott's directive to investigate parents of transgender children for child abuse, based on this claim that gender-affirming care constitutes abuse. This has led to a wave of fear and uncertainty for families with transgender children.
It's heartbreaking to read about families who feel they have to flee the state simply to protect their children.
It's a stark reminder of how these tactics can be used to target and marginalize already vulnerable groups. And it's not just about direct action, it's about creating a climate of fear and suspicion that makes it impossible for people to live their lives openly and authentically.
The article also points to the increasing efforts to ban books and censor certain ideas in schools, often under the guise of protecting children from harmful or inappropriate material.
Texas has been at the forefront of these efforts, with laws like HB 3979 and SB 3, which place these broad restrictions on what can be taught in schools, particularly when it comes to topics like race, gender, and sexuality.
These laws are incredibly vague, leaving educators vulnerable to complaints from parents or community members who might object to certain books or ideas.
It essentially deputizes anyone with an opinion to act as a censor, chilling open discussion and critical thinking in the classroom.
And the article tells the story of Lauren Miller, a teacher in Texas, who had to self-censor her lessons for fear of being reported. She was afraid to even talk about her own abortion experience, even with close friends, because she didn't know who might be listening or who might be inclined to report her.
It creates a climate where teachers are forced to choose between their own integrity and their livelihoods.
It seems like these modern-day examples, particularly in Texas, share some chilling similarities with the tactics used during the Red Scare. Both rely on fear, suspicion, and a sense of othering to silence dissent and enforce a particular worldview.
And what's particularly concerning is how these tactics are being amplified and enabled by modern technology and the vast amounts of data we generate online.
This is where the concept of the snitch state takes on a whole new dimension. It's no longer just about neighbor reporting on neighbor. It's about a system where our online activities, our social media posts, our digital footprints can be used against us.
The article mentions the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 as a particularly alarming example of how these trends could be further amplified under a second Trump administration.
Okay, so what exactly is Project 2025, and why is it so concerning?
So Project 2025, it's basically a blueprint for a second Trump term, and it includes some pretty radical proposals that would significantly expand the government's power to surveil and punish its critics.
What kind of proposals are we talking about?
We're talking about things like allowing for a political purge of the federal workforce, classifying teachers and librarians who provide access to certain materials as registered sex offenders, and making it easier to prosecute journalists for publishing leaked information.
This is some seriously scary stuff.
Yeah.
It sounds like we're on a slippery slope towards authoritarianism where any form of dissent is deemed disloyal and punishable.
And the article argues that these trends are not limited to the federal level. They're already playing out at the state and local levels, particularly in conservative-leaning areas.
So it's not just about Trump. It's about a broader shift in conservative ideology towards greater control and surveillance, using fear and division as tools to silence opposition.
Exactly. And the article warns that if we're not careful, this erosion of our freedoms could become irreversible.
So what can we do? If we're living in a society where anyone could be a potential informant, how do we protect ourselves, our families, our communities?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at some practical steps you can take to safeguard your privacy, resist these encroaching systems, and push back against this disturbing trend.
So before the break, we were just talking about this really unsettling concept of a modern-day snitch state, using Texas as a stark example. And it's just so clear that these tactics, they really prey on our deepest fears and anxieties, creating a society where everyone is suspicious of everyone else.
You're absolutely right. It is a chilling thought. And as we were just discussing, technology and the beta economy have added a whole new layer of complexity to this issue.
You mentioned the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, and it just feels like something out of a dystopian novel.
Yeah.
But it's a stark reminder of what's at stake here.
Absolutely. Project 2025 lays out this roadmap for a second Trump administration. And it's full of these proposals that would essentially dismantle the guardrails of our democracy. Imagine a world where expressing dissent could land you on a watch list, where teachers are afraid to teach, and where journalists are silenced for doing their jobs.
It's terrifying, but it's also a call to action.
Yeah.
We can't just sit back and let this happen. So let's talk about what we can do to resist this trend.
Well, I think the first step is awareness. You need to be informed about the laws and policies being enacted in your community. And at the national level, knowledge is power, and understanding how these systems work is crucial for protecting yourself and your loved ones.
So being an informed citizen, paying attention to what's happening in our government,
Yeah.
that's absolutely essential.
Exactly. And it's not just about following the news. It's about understanding the nuances of these laws, how they're being implemented, and who they're targeting. For example, that bounty law we discussed earlier, Senate Bill 8 in Texas. It's crucial to understand its specific provisions and how it's being used to not only restrict abortion access, but also to create this climate of fear and surveillance.
Okay, so awareness is key. What else can we do on a practical level to protect ourselves?
Well, we need to be mindful of our digital footprints. In today's interconnected world, we're constantly generating data about ourselves, our location, our communications, our online activities, and this data can be collected, aggregated, and analyzed by governments and corporations, often without our knowledge or consent.
So being more careful about what we share online, using strong passwords and being aware of the privacy settings on our devices and social media accounts, those are all good practices.
Absolutely. But it's also important to understand the role of data brokers. These companies that collect and sell our personal information. They operate in the shadows and their practices are often opaque. But they play a significant role in creating these systems of surveillance and control.
This raises an important question. If our data is already out there, how can we truly protect our privacy?
That's a complex issue and there's no easy answer, but there are steps you can take to minimize your exposure. You can opt out of data broker databases, you can use privacy-focused search engines and browsers, and you can limit the amount of personal information you share online.
It's almost as if we need to become more conscious consumers of technology, more aware of the trade-offs we're making when we use these services.
Exactly. We need to start thinking about our data as a valuable asset that deserves to be protected.
And it's not just about individual action, right? We need to support organizations that are fighting for our digital rights and privacy.
Absolutely. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Access now are doing incredible work to challenge these invasive surveillance practices and hold governments and corporations accountable.
Supporting these organizations through donations or volunteering our time is another concrete way to make a difference.
And don't underestimate the power of your voice. Speaking out against injustice, writing to your elected officials, participating in protests, these actions can have a real impact. The article highlights the work of groups like the Texas Civil Rights Project and the Lilith Fund, who are fighting back against these restrictive laws and supporting those who are most affected.
It's inspiring to see people on the ground fighting for their rights in their communities. Their courage and determination give me hope.
Remember, you're not alone in this. There's a whole network of individuals and organizations who are working to protect our freedoms and push back against this creeping authoritarianism.
The article mentioned the chilling effect these tactics have on free speech, particularly in schools. What can we do to support teachers and students who are facing censorship?
Supporting organizations like PE America, which advocates for freedom of expression and education, is a great way to start. You can also attend school board meetings, speak out against book bans, and encourage open dialogue in your community about the importance of intellectual freedom.
It's important to remember that these aren't just abstract political debates. They have real-world consequences for real people. The article shared the personal stories of women in Texas who were forced to carry unwanted pregnancies to term because of these restrictive laws.
Their stories are a powerful reminder of the human cost of these policies. We need to approach this issue with empathy and understanding, recognizing that these laws are not just about controlling women's bodies, they're about controlling their lives, their futures, their very sense of autonomy.
It's also about controlling the narrative, about silencing dissenting voices, and about enforcing a particular ideology.
Exactly, and this is where the concept of the snitch state becomes even more insidious. It's not just about reporting on illegal activities, it's about encouraging people to report on anything they deem unacceptable or unpatriotic, creating this culture of self-censorship and conformity.
It's a chilling thought, but it's also a challenge.
Hmm.
How do we break free from this cycle of fear and suspicion and create a society where we can trust each other, where we can disagree without fear of retribution, where we can live our lives authentically without the threat of being reported?
That's a profound question, and it's one we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at the historical parallels, the psychological mechanisms at play, and the potential consequences of this trend if left unchecked. But most importantly, we'll discuss what we can do collectively and individually to resist this disturbing shift towards a snitch state and reclaim our fundamental freedoms.
We'll be back in just a moment to wrap up our deep dive into the rise of the snitch state. Welcome back to our deep dive, into the rise of the snitch state. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the historical echoes of McCarthyism to these chilling realities of modern-day Texas, where laws and policies are basically turning citizens into informants.
Yeah, it's been a heavy conversation, but an absolutely crucial one. What we're seeing is this systematic attempt to erode the very foundations of a free and open society. It's about silencing dissent, controlling the narrative, and enforcing a narrow, often discriminatory worldview.
One thing that keeps coming to mind for me is the psychological impact of all this.
Mhm.
Living with this constant fear of being watched, reported on. It's got to be exhausting, soul-crushing even.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the self-censorship it breeds. You hesitate to speak your mind, to support a cause you believe in, to even confide in your friends for fear that someone might overhear and misinterpret your words.
And as we discussed earlier, this fear, it's particularly acute for marginalized groups who are already facing discrimination and prejudice. They become even more vulnerable in a system that encourages people to report on anything that deviates from a narrow definition of normal.
It's a vicious cycle. The more people self-censor, the less diverse perspectives are heard, the more entrenched those narrow definitions become, and the more power those in control have to shape the narrative.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about individual actions like being aware of our digital footprint and supporting organizations that are fighting for our rights. But it can feel like such a David and Goliath situation.
Yeah, I understand that feeling. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of such powerful forces. But history has taught us time and again that even the most entrenched systems of control can be challenged and overturned. Think back to the McCarthy era. It seemed unstoppable at the time, but eventually public opinion shifted. People spoke out, and McCarthy's power crumbled.
It's a reminder that we, the people, have the power to change the course of history. But it takes courage. It takes persistence, and it takes collective action.
Exactly. And it starts with understanding that we're not alone in this fight. There's a growing movement of people who are pushing back against these authoritarian trends. Activists, journalists, educators, artists, everyday citizens who are refusing to be silenced.
It's about finding our own ways to contribute, no matter how small they may seem.
Absolutely. Every act of resistance, every voice raised in opposition chips away at the edifice of control. It's about reclaiming our agency, our right to think freely, to speak our truth, and to live our lives without fear of being reported on.
One thing that really struck me in the Atlantic article was the author's call to reclaim the idea of community, to resist the temptation to see our neighbors as potential threats.
Yes, that's such an important point. The snitch state thrives on division, on pitting us against each other, on turning us into informants rather than allies. We need to resist that impulse and instead focus on building bridges, fostering understanding, and creating communities where we can support each other even when we disagree.
So it's not just about fighting against something. It's about fighting for something, for a society that values individual liberty, freedom of expression, and a sense of shared humanity.
And that brings us to a final provocative thought. What if, instead of fearing the snitch state, we embraced the idea of being guardians of democracy? What if, instead of reporting on each other, we committed to looking out for one another, to protecting each other's rights and freedoms, and to holding those in power accountable?
That's a beautiful idea. It shifts the focus from suspicion and fear to empathy and solidarity. It's about reclaiming our power as citizens and standing up for the values that make our democracy worth fighting for.
We face a critical choice: to succumb to the fear and division that fuels the snitch state, or to rise up and become the guardians of democracy that our nation so desperately needs.
It's a challenge I hope you'll take to heart. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a heavy but essential conversation. We'll be back next time for another exploration of the ideas and issues shaping our world.